My name is Daniel. I've been hunting in Alabama since I was big enough to sit still and keep my mouth shut in a deer stand. I work full-time at a small equipment rental place outside of town. Hunting isn't my job. It's just what I do when I'm not at work. Some guys play golf or sit in bars. I sit in trees and watch the woods. I live in a small town, not too far from Montgomery, in central Alabama. Folks lease land from timber companies or family landowners and split the cost between buddies. That's how I hunt. I pay my share every year for a small lease and try to take a couple of deer to fill the freezer. I'm just a normal working guy who likes being out in the woods. I don't poach, I don't spotlight, and I don't shoot at anything I can't identify. I'm not into ghost stories, Bigfoot shows, or any of that TV nonsense. Before this happened, the craziest thing I'd ever seen in the woods was a boar killing a bobcat. This happened on our private lease about 45 minutes from my house. It's roughly 120 acres, mostly planted pines about 15 years old, with some hardwood fingers and a creek bottom on one side. We've got a few shooting lanes cut, a couple of ladder stands, and 2 box stands that we built ourselves out of plywood and 2x4s. Nothing fancy, but they keep the wind out and keep you off the ground. The stand I was in that night is one of those box stands. It sits on 4 lag-bolted posts about 10 feet off the ground, up on a little rise that overlooks a Y-shaped food plot. We call it the Y stand for that reason. There's a narrow lane that runs straight out from the front of the stand for about 100 yards, and then splits left and right into 2 thinner lanes, pines on both sides, thicker hardwoods behind the stand. From inside, you're up high enough that nothing on the ground can see you unless it's looking straight up at the window. Inside the stand, there's a small office chair, a couple of hooks for gear, and a little shelf where I keep a flashlight, extra gloves, and a thermos. The walls are insulated, the interior is painted dark, and the outside is covered in camo netting and old burlap. There are 3 narrow shooting windows that swing open on hinges, one to the front over the main lane, one slightly left, and one slightly right. When the windows are closed, you're basically in a dark box. Your scent and movement are pretty well contained, especially if you're careful. My rifle that night was a bolt-action Ruger American rifle chambered in .243 Winchester. It's a light, handy deer rifle. I shoot a 95-grain soft point in it. That cartridge is more than enough for white-tailed deer and most hogs if you put the shot in the right place. It's accurate, and it recoils light enough that I can stay on target. I've killed plenty of deer with it, and never felt undergunned until this particular night. This was late in the season. It was a cold, clear night in January. We'd had some decent buck activity on cameras, mostly at night. I decided I was going to sit as long as I could stand it and see what was really moving through there after dark. I don't normally hunt all night, but I'd taken the next day off work and told my wife I was going to pull a long sit. I got to the property around 3 in the afternoon, checked a couple of trail cameras, and walked into the stand well before sunset. I like to be settled in early, let the woods calm down, and let my scent die off around the path I walked in on. Before climbing up, I put out a mix of scent lures. I don't go crazy with it, but I do use them. That evening, I had doe-in-heat scent out on 2 drag lines and a dominant buck urine wick hung near the left leg of the Y. I also had a little bit of my own homemade mix, basically a combination of tarsal glands, a little urine I saved from a buck earlier in the season, and some commercial scent, dabbed on a rag about 40 yards out on the right lane. The idea is to create the impression that there's more than one deer moving around and hanging out in that area. To be clear, I knew that using all that scent also meant I might draw in coyotes, bobcats, or hogs. That didn't bother me. I've shot plenty of coyotes out of that stand. The box is high and tight enough that animals generally don't peg you unless you're sloppy. Once I was up in the stand, I settled in. I cracked the windows open just enough to see and shoot, maybe an inch or 2, and tried to keep movement to a minimum. My phone went into airplane mode. No music, no podcasts. Just me, the rifle across my lap, and whatever the night was going to do. The first few hours were completely normal. As the sun went down, I watched squirrels wind down for the day. A couple of does drift through the far end of the food plot, and a small spike buck moved through too fast and too nervously for me to consider a shot. Once full dark settled in, the woods got that usual quiet, then slowly picked back up again. I could hear distant dogs barking on somebody's land, a few hundred yards away. An owl called from the hardwoods behind me. I remember thinking it was a good, calm night to be out there. I checked my watch around 9 and again around midnight. Both times, nothing strange had happened. I heard what I figured were hogs moving somewhere off to the right around midnight. Heavy steps and the occasional grunt. But they never came into the lane. Everything felt routine. My eyes were adjusted to the dark, and I could make out the pale strips of the lanes and the dark walls of pines on either side. The only real light was a faint glow from the sky, and that was enough to see shapes and movement out to maybe 50 or 60 yards. Up to that point, if you had told me I was about to see something that would make me question what actually lives in those woods, I would have laughed and told you to lay off the late-night TV. Sometime, a little after 1 in the morning, things changed. I don't know the exact time because I wasn't looking at my watch. What I remember is that the normal background noise just sort of faded out. The dogs I'd heard earlier stopped. The owl behind me shut up. Even the small sounds, like little rustles from mice or birds, went away. It wasn't a big, dramatic moment. It was just this slow settling where all of a sudden I realized I wasn't hearing anything, except the faint hum of the heater and my own breathing. At first I figured maybe a coyote or a hog was working its way in. That's normal. When something heavier moves through, the smaller stuff goes quiet. I leaned forward a little in the chair and rested my hand on the rifle. I kept my face close to the front window, looking down the main lane. The first sound I caught wasn't on the lane. It came from my left, somewhere back in the pines. It was a single heavy step on a twig, then nothing, then another one on the leaves. Not fast, just a slow, uneven walking pace. It sounded like weight. A large boar, maybe. You can tell the difference after a while. I eased the rifle up across the windowsill and tried to look left without swinging the barrel around too fast and banging it on the wood. The sound came again. Step, pause, step. The spacing was odd. One step sounded normal. The next sounded like something dragging or landing lighter, like somebody with a bad leg or a bum hip. Whatever it was, stopped just inside the tree line on the left leg of the Y. I couldn't see it yet. I stared at that strip of black timber until my eyes burned. After a minute or two, I caught movement between two trunks. Something big and tall moved past an opening. It was on all fours. The back cleared the top of the broom straw in one smooth line. No deer or hog I've ever seen moves like that. I remember thinking, maybe it's just a big hog that's walking crooked somehow. We've got some nasty ones out there. But even as I thought that, my gut was already telling me no. It was too tall in the shoulder for a hog, and the way it placed its feet didn't match. Hogs root and shuffle. This thing was placing each foot like it knew exactly where it wanted to put it. It stayed in the left woods for a while, moving back and forth, never fully stepping into the open. I would catch a piece of back, a shoulder, then nothing. The wind was drifting from the lanes back toward me, which is what I wanted for deer. I realized pretty quickly that whatever this was had hit the scent. Every time it crossed near where I had the buck urine wick hanging, it would stop, and you could hear it pull air in, long, deep sniffs, like it was trying to sort through different smells. There was a ragged kind of low sound that went with it. Not quite a growl, more like air rumbling in a big chest. I've heard big dogs scenting the air before, and this was like that, just louder and deeper. It didn't sound angry. It sounded focused. After a few minutes of that, it moved. I heard leaves crunch at an angle that told me it was swinging around toward the front lane. Sure enough, a few seconds later, it slid into view out in front of me, maybe 30 or 40 yards out. It stepped out of the pines onto the edge of the lane, still on all fours. That was the first time I really saw the size of it. The front end was massive. The shoulders looked almost as wide as the hood of my pickup. The back was thick, not saggy fat, just heavy. Even hunched low, the top of its back looked about level with the midsection of a decent-sized doe. If it had stood fully upright on its back legs, I don't know exactly how tall it would have been, but I'd put the whole animal somewhere in the 500-pound range. I'll admit, I was nervous as hell, and that number might not be perfect, but I've been around enough hogs and cattle to know it was in that kind of ballpark. It was way bigger than anything I'd ever seen moving in those woods. The legs were wrong for a hog or a dog. The front legs were thick from shoulder to what looked like an elbow. Below that, they tapered down and bent again at a joint more like a wrist. The feet, if you want to call them that, weren't paws. Even from that distance, with my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see length in the toes. They looked like long fingers spread wide to carry the weight. The back end was just as heavy, but one of the hind legs didn't move like the other. Every second or third step, the hip would hitch, and that foot would land a little short, as if it had an old injury. The head is what really got to me. When it turned to sniff the lane, I expected to see a big dog head or something close. What I saw didn't match anything I know. The muzzle was distinct, but the proportions were off. The lower jaw seemed too long, and the entire skull looked a bit too broad. The ears sat out on the sides and were too low, and one of them looked torn or folded in a way that didn't match the other. The forehead was round and almost straight down, not sloped like that of a canine or a bear. The ridges over the eyes, the way the skin folded there, reminded me more of a person frowning than any kind of animal. Sure, it was dark, and I might have just imagined some of it, but it was like somebody had mashed a man's face and a dog's face together, shifted the bones around, and then stretched skin and fur over it without caring if anything lined up right. I brought the Ruger up and laid the crosshairs on its weird head. My first thought was automatic. If it breaks for the stand, I'm going to try to make the first one count. Then the second thought hit. The 243 suddenly felt small. On a deer, sure. Even a good-sized hog. But on something that size, with that much bone and muscle up front, I didn't think I'd be able to put it down fast enough, especially in the dark, with my hands trembling that hard. I sat there with the rifle shouldered and just watched. It didn't look straight at the stand. It worked its nose back and forth, sniffing toward the doe-in-heat scent, then toward the buck urine, then lifting its head like it was trying to pick me up, too. Its problem was the same thing that helps me with deer. I had 3 different strong scent sources pulling in 3 different directions, and I was sealed up in a dark box high above ground level. The air was carrying all that smell back toward me, but it was mixing in a way that didn't give a clean line. The animal stepped out a little farther into the lane, then cut right, moving toward the leg where I had my homemade mix on the rag. It stayed on all fours the whole time. Every now and then, it would kind of rock its front end higher, like it wanted to stand all the way up but couldn't quite get there. With that much bulk, it looked like getting fully upright was a chore. At one point, it ended up almost directly under the stand, maybe 10 or 15 yards out from the base. I couldn't see it through the front window anymore. I could only hear it, and that was worse. It sounded like somebody dragging a heavy coat through leaves, with the occasional solid thunk when a front foot hit a root or log. I could hear it breathing, slow, heavy breaths you feel in your own chest. My hands were slick on the stock, my heart banging hard enough I was sure it could hear it. There was this wet animal stink that drifted up, like wet dog, rotten meat, and something chemical I can't quite name, and I damn near shit myself knowing that smell was coming off something that close and that big. I sat as still as I've ever sat in my life. The rifle was still up, pointed at the window, but at that angle I would have had to swing hard left and crack a side window to get a shot, and that kind of movement and noise would have given me away for sure. I told myself, don't move unless it hits the ladder. If it hits the ladder, you make a move. Until then, let it figure itself out. The animal paced back and forth under and around the stand for what felt like forever. Realistically, it was probably 10 or 15 minutes. It would drift out toward one of the scent spots, stop, sniff hard, make that low rumbling noise, then circle back closer to the stand like it knew something wasn't adding up. A couple of times it bumped something, a small sapling or a bush, and I heard branches shake. The closest moment was when it stopped somewhere just beneath the front window and a little left. The stand floor picked up a faint vibration, as someone had leaned against one of the posts. The breathing got louder. I could hear little clicks when it shifted its weight, like claws on bark or on the metal ladder. I was sure that was it, that I'd feel the ladder move and hear it start to climb. Not that that would have worked with that kind of weight. It would have just collapsed the whole stand, which was just as bad for me, but it didn't try. Instead, after a long, drawn-out minute, I heard it move off again, this time angling away toward the right lane. The steps got a little farther apart. The breathing faded somewhat. It hit the rag where my homemade scent was and stayed there a while, thrashing the brush around it. It made a frustrated sound then, a kind of choked, half growl, half yelp that I've never heard from any normal animal. After that, its circles started getting wider. I could track it by sound as it moved from one scent lure to another, but each pass took it a little farther from the stand. Eventually, the heavy steps shifted back into the thicker timber beyond the lanes, and the small sounds of the woods started to creep back in. The whole time, I never took a shot. I kept telling myself the same thing, that 243 might hurt it, but if it didn't drop clean and that thing crashed into the stand, I was done. Staying hidden and letting the scent do its job seemed like the only smart play. I didn't climb down while it was still dark. Even after the sounds faded and the little noises of the woods came back, I stayed put. I told myself I was just being cautious, but the truth is I was scared to step out of that box with only a flashlight and 10 rounds of 243 between me and whatever that thing was. I sat there with the rifle in my hands until the sky started to lighten up in the east. When there was enough gray in the lanes to see the outlines of the trees clearly, I finally eased the windows all the way open and listened. Everything sounded normal again. Birds, a squirrel fussing somewhere off to the right, distant traffic noise if I really focused. I climbed down the ladder slowly and stood at the bottom for a minute just looking and listening, the Ruger still loaded and ready. The food plot in front of the stand looked the same as it always did, just frosted over. If I hadn't lived through the last few hours, I could have convinced myself nothing had happened. Then I walked out into the lane and started looking at the ground. There were tracks everywhere in the thin frost and soft spots. Deer prints, old boot tracks from me and the other guys, and on top of all that, the ones that didn't fit anything I had ever seen before. The first kind I noticed were the big ones down by where I had the buck urine wick hanging. They were in the softer dirt near the edge of the lane, clear as day. At first glance I thought, bear, even though bears are extremely rare in Alabama and have never been seen on our lease. When I squatted down, that theory didn't hold up anyway. The prints didn't even remotely look like paws. They looked like huge hands. Each print was wider than my palm and longer than my outstretched hand from wrist to fingertip. There was a broad pad area toward the back, and ahead of that, 4 deep impressions in a row where something like fingers had dug in. You could see where the tips had sunk deeper, like claws or nails had bitten into the dirt. The spacing between each step was long, longer than my normal stride walking, and I'm not a short guy. The other set of tracks was what bothered me more. I found those closer to the base of the stand and along the path it had taken under and around it. They weren't round or splayed like dog tracks. These looked more like someone had walked barefoot out there, except they were shorter and deeper. Each one had a clear heel and what looked like the ball of a foot, then several stubby toe marks up front. They weren't long like a normal human footprint, more compact, but the shape was close enough that my brain put them in the same category right away. The depth was what threw me. I could step right beside them in my hunting boots and barely leave a mark in the frost. These prints were punched in like someone 3 times my weight had stomped there. Standing there looking at both sets, those big hand-looking prints and the short, heavy foot-looking ones, I couldn't pretend they were anything I could place. There was too much that looked at least a little human in both of them. Not all the way, but enough to put the idea in my head and keep it there. That part got to me more than the size did. I've been around big animals. I've had hogs charge and had to climb a tree. Size you can understand. Hooves, paws, claws. You can put those in a box in your mind. Looking at those prints and seeing hints of hands and feet, that was different. That's the part that put the cold in my stomach in broad daylight. I followed the trail as best I could down the left leg of the Y and then across toward the right, where my homemade scent rag had been. It all lined up with what I heard in the dark, circles around the stand, stops at each scent spot, then a wider loop out into the thicker timber beyond the lanes. After 50 or 60 yards into the pines, the ground turned rougher and drier, and the tracks got harder to pick out. By the time I hit the edge of the creek bottom, they were gone in the leaf litter. On the walk back in, I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I knew it was long gone. The woods looked normal, but they didn't feel normal to me anymore. When I got back to the truck, I sat there for a bit, drinking cold coffee out of a thermos and trying to decide whether to say anything to the other guys. We've got a group chat for the lease where we share trail cam pictures, talk about who's hunting where, and complain about people poaching near the property line. I opened the chat and typed out a couple of different versions of what I wanted to say, then erased them. I knew if I told it straight, hey, I had some kind of 500-pound, half-dog, half-man thing under my stand last night, I'd never hear the end of it. Best case, they'd think I'd been drinking. Worst case, I'd be the guy everybody laughs about. In the end, I went with something simple. I asked if anybody had seen or heard anything strange on the lease lately. Big animals moving around at night, weird tracks, anything like that. One guy sent a laughing emoji. Another said he'd seen more hog sign near the creek, but nothing crazy. Nobody said anything about seeing anything like what I saw. I typed one more message and left it at that. I told them I'd run into what I thought was a very large, unknown animal near the Y stand in the middle of the night, and that everybody should be careful walking in and out in the dark, especially alone. I didn't give details. I didn't mention hands or feet or faces. I just hit send and put the phone down. I've hunted that lease since, but I haven't done another all-night sit in that stand, and I don't go out there with just the deer rifle anymore. I still hope that whatever it was just wandered through once, got confused by the scent, and moved on to somewhere else. That's the story I tell myself when I head out there now. But every time I ease the truck door shut before daylight and start walking down a trail, I think about those tracks and how much of a person I saw in them. And I can't help but feel like there's more out there than just deer and hogs watching the woods with me. My name is Mark. I'm 37 years old, divorced, and I've been driving a truck for a living since I was 21. I own my rig and haul mostly dry freight out of Georgia for a mid-sized company based outside Atlanta. I'm just a working guy who spends most of his time looking at white lines, fuel prices, and the clock. I grew up outside Macon. Nobody in my family had money. College wasn't an option for me. By the time I finished high school, I already had a plan. Trucking seemed like the quickest way to a nice paycheck and some kind of independence, so that's what I ended up doing. I put in my years on regional runs, moved up to longer routes, and finally bought my own truck 2 years ago. My marriage didn't survive the schedule and the stress. We divorced shortly after I became independent. I don't have kids. The truck is basically my whole life now. I'm saying all of this because I want it clear what kind of person I am. I'm not into ghost stories or any of that. My hobbies are watching football, listening to podcasts in the cab, and occasionally fishing when I actually have a day off. I don't drink much anymore because it doesn't mix well with early pickups and DOT inspections. By the time this incident happened, I had more than a decade on the road. I'd driven all over the Southeast and up the East Coast. I've seen wrecks, tornado damage, bad weather, and some shady situations at truck stops. I know the difference between a deer, a bear, and somebody trying to mess with you in a parking lot. You learn to pay attention to small details if you want to stay safe. This happened off Interstate 20 in Alabama, not far from Talladega. I'm not going to name the exact truck stop because I still run that route, and I don't want people turning it into a circus. But it's one of those older stops, not a big new travel center with 10 different fast food chains, more like a worn-down place that has been there since the 80s. You know the type of place. A couple of fuel islands for trucks, a row of diesel pumps, and a separate area for cars. Big gravel lot around the back, where the long-haul guys park for the night. There's a narrow line of trees along the property line, then a shallow ditch, then more woods. On the other side, beyond the trees, there's a 2-lane county road and some fields. It was late October. I remember that clearly because I had a load of Halloween candy coming out of a warehouse near Birmingham, headed back toward Atlanta. My schedule had me tight on hours for the week, so I decided to shut down early instead of pushing it and risking a violation. I pulled into the truck stop sometime around 10:30 at night. The forecast hadn't mentioned anything extreme. It was just a cool, dry night. The lot was about half full when I parked. A couple of reefers running loud, one flatbed guy with tarps flapping, and a few day cabs bobtailing. Nothing unusual. I fueled up, parked in the back row near the tree line, and went inside to pay, grab a coffee, and use the shower. Inside, everything was normal. Cashier behind bulletproof glass, a few drivers hanging around the small seating area, some locals in pickup trucks stopping in for cigarettes and snacks. Around 2 in the morning, I had to go for a piss. That's pretty standard for me on the road. Drink too much coffee in the afternoon, and it catches up with you in the middle of the night. I could have walked back inside to use the restroom, but I didn't feel like walking that far. Usually, I just handle it behind the trailer or near the tree line if the area is dark enough and nobody's around. The nearest truck to me was maybe 3 or 4 spots down. Its cab was dark, curtains drawn. I didn't see anyone walking around. I slipped on my Crocs, grabbed a small flashlight I keep by the driver's seat, and got out. The air was cool and still. The lot was quiet except for the rumble of a reefer unit to my left, and a distant highway hiss. The asphalt near the fuel island was lit up by the overhead canopy, but back where I was parked, things were much darker. You could still see the shapes of the trucks and the line of trees, but details were lost. My plan was simple: walk a few steps past the back of my trailer, cross the thin strip of gravel, and stand near the ditch by the tree line where nobody would see me from the building or the road. I'd done that same thing at 100 different truck stops. It felt safer than walking across the whole lot half asleep, just to use the bathroom inside, especially at that hour. I rounded the back corner of my trailer and stepped out toward the darker area by the ditch. I had my flashlight in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. My eyes had adjusted to the low light, and I didn't want to blind myself. From where I stood, I could see the glow of the truck stop building to my right and the silhouettes of a few other trucks. The ditch itself was mostly just a darker strip between the gravel and the trees. That's the exact spot where everything changed from a normal night on the road to something I still think about every time I get out of the cab at night. I was standing there, about a step or two from the edge of the gravel, when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just my own footsteps echoing in my head, but this was different. It sounded wet and rhythmic, like somebody working on a plate of ribs with their mouth open. There was also this faint crunching, like small bones or cartilage being chewed. I stopped pissing and just listened. The reefer noise and highway hiss were still there in the background, but underneath that, I could clearly hear something moving down in the ditch, maybe 30 or 40 feet to my left. Whatever it was working on something. There was a dragging sound, and then that chewing again. My first thought was that it was a dog or maybe a couple of strays going through some trash. Then I remembered the truck stop didn't keep any dumpsters back by the tree line. Most of the garbage was up closer to the building. I took half a step back toward the trailer and just stood still. My eyes were already adjusted, but from where I was, the ditch was still just a dark strip. I could make out a lump on the ground where the sounds were coming from, but that was it. I debated just letting it go, turning around, and minding my own business. For a second, that seemed like the smartest option. Curiosity got the better of me. I raised the flashlight, pointed it toward the ditch, and clicked it on. The beam wasn't strong. It's a cheap light I bought at a truck stop in Tennessee. Nothing tactical, but it was enough. The first thing it lit up was the side of the ditch. Muddy slope, some weeds, the glint of standing water in the bottom. Then it hit the thing in the middle. There was a deer down there, or what was left of one. I could see the white of the belly fur and the legs sticking out at an angle, stiff. The rib cage was open. Something had pulled it apart from the front, not neatly like a butcher, but ripped. The ribs were bent outward, and there was dark meat and shine where the organs should have been. Bent over that carcass was an animal, but it wasn't like any dog or coyote I've ever seen. At first, my brain tried to make it a big German shepherd or maybe a wolf-dog mix, but the proportions were off. It was a lot bigger than any wolf I've seen. Even hunched over, it took up most of the width of the ditch, and the body looked thick and solid, not lanky. The back was too long, the shoulders too high, and there was this strange curve to the spine, like it had extra length between the shoulders and hips. If you'd asked me right then to guess the weight, I would have said 400 or 500 pounds easy, but I'll admit I was nervous as hell, and that number might be off. What I'm sure of is that it was way too big to be anything you'd call a normal canine. It was down on all fours, front limbs braced on either side of the deer's chest. When the light hit it, it froze in place, almost like someone had yelled, "Stop!" Its head lifted slowly, not a quick jerk. I saw a muzzle come up from inside the rib cage, strings of meat hanging from it, and my brain just stalled. In the light, its head didn't look anything like that of a dog or a wolf. The more I stared, the less it fit anything I knew. The lower jaw seemed too long, the upper too short, the skull too wide through the temples, like somebody had grabbed pieces from different heads and forced them together. The ears sat too far out on the sides and too low, and they didn't match. One looked torn or folded wrong. Around the brow and cheekbones, there were shapes that looked uncomfortably human, like parts of a man's face buried under all that fur and pulled out of place. The nose didn't sit clean at the tip as it should on a muzzle. It was more on top of it, pushed up and back, with the nostrils facing partly forward and partly down. I remember thinking, very clearly in the middle of everything, that I didn't have a proper word for what I was looking at. It was just wrong in a way that made my stomach flip, and the hair stand up on my arms. The eyes reflected the light, bright and pale, not red like in movies, just a strong white-yellow flash that locked straight onto me. For a second, it didn't blink. I felt my whole body go tight, like when you almost step out into traffic and a car blows past you. That automatic, full-body jolt. The thing's front legs, or arms, whatever you want to call them, were wrong for a four-legged animal. From the shoulder to the elbow, they looked thick and muscled, more like a person's upper arm than an animal's front leg, with the muscle bunching and shifting under the fur when it moved. Below the elbow, they narrowed and then changed angle at a joint that looked too much like a human wrist for my comfort. The ends weren't paws. They were large hands with fingers that were both long and thick. I counted at least 4 full digits on the near side, each one jointed, with darker skin or pads showing between the fur. At the end of each digit, there was a dark, curved claw, at least an inch long, and ending in a sharp point. In that moment, it reminded me more of a big man kneeling over that deer with his hands buried in its chest than anything else. The chest and shoulders were broad, covered in dark, patchy fur. Not a nice, even coat like a healthy dog. There were thin spots where the skin showed through, and the fur around the mouth and neck was wet and darker, probably from blood. The stomach area looked lean, no big gut hanging down. The legs were bent backward at the joint, the way a dog's or deer's are, but the thighs were thicker than you'd expect on an animal. It started to straighten up while still looking at me. I watched its back rise higher and higher until it was no longer on all fours. It shifted its weight and stood upright in the ditch. The top of its head came up level with the lot, right about where my boots were, maybe a little higher. The ditch was about 7 feet deep, best I could tell. For a couple of seconds, we just stood there, facing each other. I had the light on it the whole time. I wasn't shaking the beam. I remember that detail clearly because I was surprised my hands weren't trembling. My body felt numb and wired at the same time, like an adrenaline dump. It lifted its head slightly and opened its mouth. I saw teeth that looked like a large dog's, just scaled up. Long canines, sharp incisors, and darker stains near the gum line. It made a low sound that I felt more in my chest than in my ears. Not a loud, movie-style roar. More like a deep growl that didn't need volume to get the point across. It was then that I finally realized I was probably in grave danger. Given its size and claws, that thing would have been able to tear me apart in no time. I had no weapon on me, not even a pocket knife. The trailer was a few steps behind me. The ladder up to the cab seemed miles away. I remember calculating that in my head. Distance to the truck, distance from the creature to me, and the fact that this thing had just gone from crouched to standing in one smooth motion, like it weighed nothing. I didn't run, but I did start backing up. I took small, careful steps so I wouldn't trip on the uneven gravel. I kept the light on it because some part of my brain decided losing sight of it would be worse than anything. As I moved, it shifted 1 foot forward. It didn't climb out of the ditch, but it adjusted its stance, as if it was considering it. Its shoulders rolled slightly, and I saw the muscles move under the fur. It never broke eye contact. The growl stopped, but its mouth was still slightly open, breath coming out in short, visible puffs. Then, instead of climbing up toward me, it did something I didn't expect. It dropped back down to more of a crouch, reached down with one hand, and grabbed the deer by what was left of the front legs and chest. It jerked the carcass like it weighed next to nothing and started dragging it along the bottom of the ditch, parallel to the tree line, away from the light. Even while it was moving, it kept its head turned toward me. Finally, when it got closer to the darker part of the tree line, it turned its head away, focused on what it was doing, and disappeared into the deeper shadow under the branches. The last thing I saw was the pale flash of its back and shoulders as it slipped between the trees. The sounds of dragging and branches snapping continued for a few seconds after I lost visual. Then it went quiet again. Same heavy silence as before, except now I was very aware of my own breathing. I backed all the way up until my shoulders hit the trailer. Only then did I realize how hard my heart was pounding. I switched the flashlight off without really deciding to, walked back, climbed up into the cab as calmly as I could manage, and locked both doors. Once I was inside, with the curtains still open, I sat there in the driver's seat looking out at that dark line of trees and the strip of gravel where I'd been standing. From that point on, the night felt different. Same truck stop, same lights, same sounds, but there was no way I was going back to sleep, like nothing had happened. I made up my mind right there that I was cutting my break short and rolling out to the next decent stop up the interstate. I'd just have to figure something out if I got pulled into an inspection, because I was not spending the night with that thing out there in the brush, right behind my trailer.